Hi guys, it's Carl from Monkey Mod. So I just got myself one of this. This is a DZP MK2 and it is a wonderful little powerhouse, but with some problems, let's just say. The biggest problem, I think also the most common problem with the MK2 is the trigger pull. The trigger pull out of the box, in my opinion, is absolute garbage. There's no consistencies and more often than not, it is just very difficult to pull the trigger, and also it jams a lot. By jamming, I mean when you pull the trigger, nothing happens. No matter how hard you pull the trigger, the blaster just won't fire when you expect it to. And in my opinion, that is a very big problem and it is a fatal flaw. I mean, for a blaster to be usable, it has to be reliable. It has to be fires every single time you pull the trigger and you expect it to fires. And I did a quick Google and found out that I'm not alone. There was some complaints about the blaster, the MK2. Sometimes they pull the trigger and it just won't fire. They have to release the trigger and then pull it again to try and fire it. And I think that really ruins the experience of using these wonderful little blasters. So in this video, I'm going to address the issues and explain to you how I actually fix this. So why the trigger actually cease? Why the trigger actually, why the blaster don't fire sometimes when you expect it to? So I found out the problem is with the trigger bar. So you can see this trigger bar, I have already modded, but excuse me. So as you can see, it is a rather long trigger bar and it is made of plastics. And you can see because of this design, it is supported by these two little plastics here that actually is not that rigid because of the material used to make this trigger. It is plastic after all. So if you just do a quick Google, you'll find that some user actually says that they have to pull the upper part of the trigger so that it will fire normally. And if you look at look at the trigger bar this way, it does make sense because it is closer. The upper part of the trigger is the closest to the trigger bar itself, so naturally it's easier to pull the trigger. But when you try to pull the trigger from the middle or the bottom, sometimes it just flat out won't fires. That is because the trigger bar actually flexes. When you pull the trigger from the bottom of the trigger, this part actually flexes upwards. So when it flexes upwards, the pointy part of the trigger bar, this wedge-shaped thing, it actually collides with the catch plate. So when that happens, no matter how hard you pull, you squeeze the trigger, it just won't fire. So what I did was I used a lighter. I used a lighter to actually hit up this part around it slowly and very carefully. So just hit it enough that I can actually bend the trigger downwards a little bit, just a little bit, like this. Just a little bit because you don't want to destroy the trigger. I don't think they actually sell spare parts of the MK2 yet, so if you destroy a trigger, I think you have a paperweight. So you have to be very careful when doing this mod. Now what this do is actually, once this mod is done, it will force the trigger downwards no matter what. So doesn't matter the blaster is primed or not, the trigger bar, this part, the wedge part, will always face downward and it will no longer flex upwards, and that will actually prevent the blaster from seizing, the trigger bar from seizing. So however, when you do this, because the angle of the trigger bar has changed, you might have to sand the wedge part a little bit, so that just to make sure that the wedge actually mates with the trigger. The wedge part of the trigger bar is mated properly to the catch plate like this. The angle must be right. Otherwise, then you will still have a very difficult time trying to fire the blaster. Right? That is one. And second is actually the trigger limiter. Now this I am really not sure why DZP decided to do this. I've already shaved mine down so you can't really see it now. It's supposed to be a bit longer, but I'm not really sure why they do this. When you have, I suppose what I can think is that prevents you from over pulling the trigger, and it will prevent the trigger being seized like this when you over pull the trigger, because the catch plate is constantly is spring loaded, so it will have a constant pressure downwards, and that will actually clamp on the trigger bar or something. I guess I'm not sure, but this is a number one reason why sometimes you pull the trigger and it just won't fire, because it actually restricts you from pulling the trigger all the way back or far enough to activate the catch like this fully, so that the piston will be released consistently. So I just shift it down slowly a bit until I can see, when I pull the trigger, I can see the trigger bar being able to fully activate the catch plate like this. Yep, like this. And then it will the trigger, the limiter part looks like this. Yeah, sorry, I can't really show you clearly on the video. But yeah, once I have done these two mods, the blaster fires amazingly well. I mean, more like how it should be. I mean, yeah, pulling a trigger of a blaster obviously is very important. You will want a very, of course you will want a very consistent trigger pull every single time, because you expect it to shoot every single time you pull the trigger. So yeah. Anyway, this is the two mods that I've done on the trigger, and then the blaster just fires really well. And yeah, if you have any questions regarding these modifications, you can leave your questions in the comment section, and I'll try to attend to you soon. And thank you for watching. I hope this video can help you in solving these weird garbage trigger problems. And thanks for watching. Alright, DZP MK2 trigger pull test after doing the two modifications on the trigger itself. Now let's see if this thing works smoothly right now. So I'm just going to slowly squeeze the trigger instead of pulling the trigger. Yep, I was not able to do this squeeze trigger thing before the modifications, which is quite bad for a trigger. So let's see if I do it in my left hand, I can show you the squeeze. So let's say if I pull the bottom side of the trigger, yep, it still fires. Yep. Right, let's try and fire this thing as fast as possible. Yep, the trigger pull becomes a lot more predictable and consistent, and it fires every single time you pull the trigger. So I think this should be the blaster out of the box, the trigger pull at least.